Thank you, Smita, and thank you to the panelists for this optimistic tone of the discussion. And I really like the timeline that was set up by the last speaker, especially Jeet, by saying that in the next GTS, we'll hopefully showcase the startups that would have been incubated in the hub. Uh, Today's sub-theme at GTS is on partnerships and resilience in the future of technology. And one area in which partnerships are very important for improving resilience is in vaccine supply chains. This is an area which has become very, very important in the last couple of years. And we have a very excellent panel to discuss how partnerships and the role of technology can be changed over the next year or so to improve the resilience of vaccine production in the world. And the speakers on the panel are Mahima Datla, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Biological E Limited, Ms. Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Executive Chairperson of Biocon Limited and a long-time supporter of this summit, Robin Davies, Head Indo-Pacific Centre for Health Security, Government of Australia. And this panel will be moderated by Neeraj Jain, Country Director, PATH India. Over to you, Neeraj.
Thank you, Suyash. Thank you for that introduction. And wow, what a fantastic panel. I feel a bit nervous moderating this panel. But an important topic from the context that we're in today, looking at securing vaccine supply chains. And I know this is on everybody's mind. And how do we look at partnerships and resilience around it? As the world is bracing for a possible third, fourth, fifth, I don't know, what we want to call it, wave with a lot of change happening, it's going to be absolutely critical that we work on strengthening our supply chains, enabling them to be more agile and responsive, while also putting equity at the center of all our conversations. The supply chains need to be more open, probably more circular than ever before. All stakeholders will have to actually come together probably and show greater willingness to share critical insights, and also even if it means partnering with their own competition. The government has a role to play. Governments can facilitate collaborations at an unprecedented level, which is going to be critical. It's also important that as we move forward, we look at technology and how we're going to use technology, procurement and delivery so that that's easily and quickly available. Visibility and transparency are going to be key, which we probably have a lot to desire for the time being, whether it's for inventory planning, selecting partners, or actually just optimizing logistical processes. Partnerships can also mean catalyzing new innovations, coordinated approaches, and look at a global solidarity model, which would definitely help us manage this pandemic and the next and our health needs going forward. The challenge is going to be, how do we get collective efforts? How do we come together as a globe, not just one country at a time? And I know that regional cooperation is going to be at the center of it all. With the right technology, with the right stakeholders, with adopting the technology as well as available data sets, analytics, etc., we'll probably have a better way forward than where we are today. Data, coming to data, that's going to be right at the center of it all. Do we have real-time data? Do we have the analytical techniques? Are we transparent about data as we move forward? And analytics will definitely play a key role in this journey that we have. I'll move straight into my first question for you, Mahima. And I know that we at PATH have been partnering with you over the last many years. And I'm going to take you back to something you said, which kind of stayed. And I'm going to quote you. So please, apologies in case I miss a word here or there. But partnerships for vaccine manufacturing is like an involved marriage. There's a lot of trust, transfer of technology, and know-how involved. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of times you just need to find the right partner. Very, very well said, very intriguing. The question is, what kind of partnerships are needed at the domestic and international levels for developing, manufacturing, and commercializing vaccines? So if you could talk a little bit about that, man.
Sure. Thanks so much, Neeraj. It's been a pleasure to work with Path and many of the stakeholders around the table today, I guess. But thanks for allowing me this opportunity. It's the first time I've been part of this forum. So yeah, I said that because I feel like to build trust, particularly in vaccine tech transfer, it's extremely challenging and takes years. And it's not enough for you just to have compliance, because other than IP, there's so much know-how transfer involved in any vaccine tech transfers. But the sorts of partnerships we've been seeing, and frankly, because of COVID, we've seen an unprecedented amount of partnership. It's been really heartwarming to see academia and industry come together. And I was smiling earlier when you said sometimes it means you work with your competition, and we've seen that happen. We've seen Sanofi work with GSK for the adjuvants, Merck working with J&J. And one would have thought even if such partnerships were to occur, they take several years to negotiate. So in our own case, I think we concluded negotiations with J&J in literally a 4-week window. So it's been heartwarming to see, the community coming together and saying, let's put everything aside and let's see how we can be part of the solution. Like I said, we partnered with Baylor College of Medicine in the early stage to down select the vaccine clones. We continue to partner with them on a lot of the work related to the animal models, particularly with the variants and so on. But I have to say that what's been, again, surprising and again in a very good way has been the partnership with governments, and particularly our own government, right? So not just in terms of funding support and creating, sustainable models for companies to be able to invest during the pandemic, because we witnessed supply chain disruptions in the early days of the pandemic. We had to involve sort of Ministry of External Affairs. We had to involve the Department of Biotechnology. Of course, Ministry of Health is involved. But I've never seen them coming together with sort of the single purpose. So it's not just partnerships in your traditional academia industry space or academia or industry, but it's also kind of the spirit of partnership even within the government. So you do need these sort of partnerships because speed is key. And, again, not reinventing the wheel. We relied on external labs to tech transfer a lot of the neutralization assays we're using, So I think everybody should be focused on what they do best and leverage each other's capabilities to be able to be part of the solution as quickly as possible. So.
Thanks, Mahima. That's absolutely fantastic. And, you're right. We've been working in the vaccine space for many decades now, and we've never seen partnerships happen, evolve, fructify at the speed that they have in this particular situation. I just want to go to the recent financial support that you received from the US Development Finance Corporation. And this was announced at the Quad Summit in March. What does it actually signify about the Quad partnership with respect to vaccine manufacturing and tech transfer? If you could just briefly sort of tell us your thoughts on that.
Sure. I'll probably just touch upon DFC and its funding significance first, and then the broader Quad partnership. So as most of you know, vaccine manufacturing involves, huge fixed costs. really long lead times, and very often unpredictable markets, particularly in the pandemic. And in our case, our company is privately held, so we've relied extensively on internal accruals and debt as our primary source of funding, which is actually, either very bold or very stupid. I don't know, but it is what it is. And it's made DFC's funding that much more significant. I mean, a loan's a loan, so it's not really the fact that we got monetary support, but the duration, the term of the loan gives us much more flexibility, because we want to make sure that our existing products can take on this loan should the pandemic cease, or should demand shift, or should the product not be successful. I mean, we're weeks away from hopefully licensing the product, so that's no longer a worry. But when we started to make the investments, 8 months ago, obviously we don't know what the clinical outcomes for the program would look like. So it made DFC's support very significant. But I think what the Quad Alliance is attempting to do is really forge partnerships amongst these 4 major countries, with the idea that India becomes the manufacturing hub and provides chunk of the volume of vaccines needed for the world. US provides funding support. Australia and Japan are supporting not only strengthening the regulatory pathways so that we can license these products in these countries, but also in supporting the last mile delivery and the logistics associated with administering vaccines. Which is particularly challenging for COVID vaccines, because different vaccines have different cold chain conditions, 228 versus -20, -70 in some instances. So I think these countries came together and agreed that vaccines and climate change are the 2 things they can agree on to work together. And frankly, at least from my perspective, it's been an extremely productive partnership. It was really helpful to really solve the supply chain disruptions that we faced during May and June this year, largely because most manufacturers were dependent on supplies coming out of the US for raw materials and critical consumables, particularly single-use technologies, which are predominantly made in the US. And not having access to those supplies was extremely disruptive. So, the Quad Alliance really helped, remove those obstacles. And that's just to cite a few things. So I keep saying that the monetary support is incidental, but it's everything else. But the idea really is to then donate doses either through the COVAX facility or through bilateral relationships, more so on the Indo-Pacific side, I would say.
Fantastic, Mahima. So yeah, you've not managed to de-risk the investment, but definitely the capital coming in has helped in your scale up, and it's been fantastic to see how BioE has grown over the last few years. Looking at what's going on. I'll move to Robin, and we'll definitely circle back to you, Mahima, in a bit. Robin, thanks for joining us. And I just want to check, Australia is now at 90% of 2 doses of COVID-19 already. What is it that you guys can do? What is it that Australia can do to really increase the global vaccine supply? And where's that headed? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to. I'll just check. Can you hear me okay? Yep. So obviously I'm speaking from the perspective of a development agency, a bilateral donor agency operating with grant funds, so public sector finance. And, the theme of this event is very much supply chains, and, development agencies are used to, I suppose, filling gaps in the market, so to speak, and dealing with market failures in some extended sense. And many of the supply chain issues in relation to COVID vaccine supply really already existed pre-pandemic. I guess what we're dealing with is a problem on a much larger, unprecedented scale, but not a problem that is itself unprecedented. So what we have sought to do, and what many other donors have sought to do, including our Quad partners, is work both on the supply side and on the demand side. On the supply side, of course, you already heard about the Quad's support for expanded vaccine manufacturing through BioE. So that's one important measure. Another important measure, which has become increasingly prominent through the last 6 months, is the sharing of doses from our own national supply. Now, there's a lot of media reporting about, you know, the size of the vaccine surpluses that have accrued to the wealthier countries, and I think it's important to point out that many countries gambled in the early stages on a number of candidate vaccines, and then, somewhat to all of our surprise, most of those candidates have come through, and even some of the ones that haven't probably will. I'm thinking of Novavax, for example. So for that reason, there is a surplus, which is coming in over time to wealthier countries, which is now it's our duty to share that surplus with developing countries, and certainly Australia is seeking to do that in real time as quickly as we can. We began doing that back in March, and by the end of this year, we will have shared around 13 million vaccines, and we hope that by the end of about March next year, that number could rise as high as 40 million out of a total pledge of 60. I won't go through all of the details, but our Quad partners and many other donors are doing this as well. So not only supporting expanded manufacturing, but also moving to redistribute that surplus with countries who need it as quickly as possible. And then the third piece on the consumption side, which we're all, of course, focused on, is how to diversify manufacturing into a broader number of locations, including mRNA manufacturing. That's a very challenging enterprise. We see that happening in South Africa through the mRNA hub there, and we see signs of the same strategies now being pursued in Asia, and we and other donors are keen to support that. So there's a lot of activity on the supply side. On the demand side, of course, apart from simply providing funding for countries that need funding to procure vaccines themselves, or funding for COVAX to supply vaccines to countries, there's a really big need to support national vaccine rollouts, everything that happens after vaccines arrive at ports of entry. That's partly a logistics exercise, but it's also everything that is involved in any normal vaccination campaign, public information, communication, workforce development, and so forth. And this is unusual in that it's a nationwide vaccination effort focused on progressively on all age cohorts. So there's a big job there. And in some countries, we are facing a particular challenge of vaccine hesitancy, and that will cause the pace of vaccine rollouts in certain countries to be, potentially glacial and extend over, in many cases, somewhere between 2 and 4 years. And again, donors, including Australia, are looking at more and more ways of reaching out to communities to build vaccine confidence through the people they trust, who on the whole are frontline healthcare workers. So that's sort of the demand side, and Mahima already talked about the support we're providing for regulatory authorities around the region, not only in relation to the registration of vaccines from a whole range of manufacturing sites, but also in relation to pharmacovigilance. So I think all of that's very important. Finally, another sub-theme of this event is partnerships. And I think we've seen COVAX is much maligned often, but I think it's important to recognise what has been achieved in a very short space of time with the construction and execution of COVAX. COVAX has obviously faced substantial supply constraints, and has faced enormous coordination challenges across the world. But I think it's important to step back and say that the model is right, the model is important, and to look ahead to how something like COVAX becomes solidified, so that in the future, the supply of pandemic vaccines, whether it's for COVID or anything else, can be appropriately multilateralized and made efficient and equitable. So COVAX has laid the groundwork for that. Also on the multilateral front, CEPI, if there was ever an organization that was created at the right time for the right purpose, that was it. And those of us who invested relatively early in CEPI, quite a small investment in Australia's case, but we're very happy that we did that, and we think the performance of that organisation has been remarkable. And CEPI, of course, works with partners all around our region, and has made quite a substantial number of very successful bets on their vaccine candidates. I think there is a role for bilateral vaccine supply, not just delivery support, but bilateral vaccine supply in certain circumstances. For example, in those countries that can only vaccinate slowly, an organisation like COVAX can't really deal with what I might describe as fiddly requirements, long-term small injections of vaccines to countries that are going to move quite slowly. And some of the countries in the Pacific might fit that description. And I think it's very important that bilateral vaccine supply is able to complement supply through multilateral mechanisms for that reason, to be responsive and to deal with some of the more complex situations. And finally, Mahima's talked very comprehensively and accurately about the Quad and the Quad vaccine partnership. So I don't need to repeat a lot of that, but it is a good example of plurilateral cooperation, which brings together the comparative advantages of 4 countries who are all prominent in the region, either in vaccine supply or in delivery support, or both. The cooperation around manufacturing is an important feature of the Quad, but so is the cooperation in relation to dose sharing from national supplies, and discussions that go on in connection with some of the harder to reach communities in several countries in our region. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Robin. That's pretty comprehensive. And you would have thought that CEPI was probably created because we knew a pandemic was coming. Absolutely well-timed. Of course, Parth has been part of that conversation from the day that CEPI got established. Even COVAX, yeah, you're right. There are a lot of challenges, but we're on the right track probably going forward. How's that going to work? We've also been part of the South Africa hub for mRNA vaccines, and I was talking to a colleague in South Africa just last night, and hearing about all the fantastic stuff that's going on there. But clearly shows that we are on the path to being able to build these partnerships, to globalize, and hopefully things will fall into place. Kiran, I'll move to you, and I want to bring out this very exciting recent partnership that got announced between Biocon and Serum Institute, and really, to ramp up vaccines treating communicable diseases across developing economies. Of course, the focus being COVID for now. I think, so my question is, how do you plan to address the inequitable access issue, both in emerging and developed economies for life-saving vaccines? What are you thinking around that direction?
So Neeraj, let me start by saying that I think health equity is at the core of our business purpose. And you know that over the years, we have been focused on providing affordable access to life-saving and essential biologic medicines. And as you know, most of these medicines were way beyond the reach of people in the developing world, only because it was so expensive and complex to make. And I think that has actually got me thinking about health equity in a big way. So apart from, developing insulins and biologic medicines for patients across the world, which I think we can honestly say we've, succeeded in a fairly good way in providing affordable access to these very, very expensive and life-saving drugs for cancer and diabetes. Obviously, the pandemic then brought in a very new focus for us. And we realized that whilst our world was all about non-communicable diseases, we realized that health has to straddle both spheres. And I think from that point of view, the pandemic actually brought out the importance of investing in affordable technologies, affordable innovation to deliver, important life-saving and, immunizing kind of properties that vaccines bring in pandemics and in other kinds of communicable diseases. And we felt that the missing component for us was vaccines. Antibodies is something that we are also focused on in terms of, dealing with non-communicable, in dealing with communicable diseases, because you know that today antibodies also offer a very interesting, treatment option for many of these, communicable diseases, including RSV, and of course in COVID itself, a number of antibody preparations are being used to tackle in the infections. So I just felt that vaccines was a very important part of that ecosystem. And I also felt that we were now getting into very new kinds of vaccines apart from the traditional vaccines. And I felt that was where this partnership could help a lot, because I think the research capabilities that we have within our company and the kind of at scale development and manufacturing capabilities that Serum has could be a very good complementary fit. And that was the way we looked at it. And it was not just about COVID, but it was about beyond COVID as well. So I think that was the rationale for forging this partnership. But I would just like to, go beyond this partnership that we, announced for Serum. I think we've developed many other partnerships. We've developed a partnership with an antibody company called Adjuvants for developing a very, broad spectrum antibody preparation for dealing with COVID-19 and all the variants. So that was an interesting partnership. Then, of course, we also developed partnerships for, medications like Remdesivir and for our own drug, which we repurposed for dealing with the cytokine release syndrome, which was itolizumab, which we partnered with one of our Indian competitors, Sun Pharma. So I think, to Mahima's point, I think the pandemic actually saw some very, very unexpected partnerships, all because we were trying to find solutions and do things collectively. And we were all aligned with our single sense of purpose, which was really to overcome the pandemic. So I think these are lessons learned which we must never forget. Secondly, I think it was also very important to see the kind of inequities that existed in the world when it came to vaccines. Although we are now at a stage of vaccine adequacy, during the time of vaccine inadequacy, there was a huge amount of inequity, as we all know. 75% of the 4.5 billion the first shots that have been rolled out in the world have gone into the arms of people in affluent countries, right? And we know that low middle-income countries and the middle-income countries are still woefully short of having any safe level of immunization. So we know that there's vaccine inequity. There was also this, I hate to say it, but there was a kind of a very skewed kind of approach to where vaccines would be made. I mean, it was very interesting that the biggest vaccine makers in the world are in India. But the Western vaccine companies chose to use CMOs in the Western world who didn't have any experience with vaccines. And I think many of the problems we have today in the supply chain is because of that mistake that those vaccine companies made, if I may say so. I think, of course, people like Mahima was able to forge an alliance with J&J, And of course, Serum had forged the alliance with Oxford University way before AstraZeneca actually came into the picture. And Novavax also forged an alliance with Serum Institute. But other than that, I think the model that most of the Western companies were using was that we will basically, divide the world between the developing world and the developed world. And we will divide the supply chains and the manufacturing between the developed world and the developing world. I think that was a wrong thing to do. I think we need to create manufacturing hubs across the world and do it in a way where we are producing these products with very good technology transfer across the world, so that it is one vaccine for the world kind of an approach. Not that, oh, if you buy a vaccine from India, it's not the same as our vaccine. We got into all those politics as well. If you remember that Covishield was not accepted in the UK for a long time and some other vaccine was not accepted. I think we have to get beyond that. When the world is fighting a pandemic, I think we have to bury all these differences and really focus on providing global solutions. So I, for one, believe that COVAX, of course, has done a tremendous job. I think Robin is right. Both CEPI and COVAX are unsung heroes. I mean, COVAX had a huge challenge because, they were promised a large supply of vaccines. And again, it was interesting to note that they were depending a lot on India and on Serum Institute, particularly for those supplies of vaccine. And unfortunately, India got hit by the second wave, and that, the supply to COVAX got delayed. But it was unfortunate that many of the other vaccine makers who could have supplied COVAX didn't do that. And, we felt the challenge of that. I mean, COVAX certainly was very challenged. Now, of course, it's in a better state because most of the world is in a safe place and there's a lot of surplus of vaccines. And of course, there is another controversy about providing sort of near expiring vaccines to many parts of the world, which countries don't want. So I think we have to get over we have to address these inequities. And I think COVAX is doing a tremendous job trying to cater and deal with global needs and in an equitable way. So I think, these are lessons learned, and, we keep talking about ESG, but are we really walking the talk as corporations go is the question I want to ask.
Fantastic. That's music to my ears for sure, because equity sits right at the center of what we do. And having seen the vaccine industry in India right from when we first got involved with Menafrivac and then the rotavirus vaccines, pneumococcal now coming out of Serum. So it's just been an exciting journey to just watch from where we've been.
And if I may just add, Neeraj, one point I wanted to make was, I think India did a tremendously good job in its vaccination rollout. I think if you look at the way India has gone about, its mega vaccination rollout in India for a country of 1.3 billion people, we have used technology very intelligently, if I may say so. And I think these are some lessons that we should share with the rest of the world, because we couldn't have done it without these strong technology platforms. I think CoWIN, Arogya Setu, all this have helped us to create these very, very data-rich databases which capture very important data about, which vaccine, which dose. And this was the technology platforms that allowed us to roll it out even in rural India in such a big way. I think the preparedness with which we went into vaccination, I think was very impressive. And I think if no one has done a real study on how India went about vaccinating such a large population in such a diverse country. And I think that is something that we must capture and share with the world. Without technology, I don't think we could have done this so effectively. So again, I think the pandemic unleashed the power of technology and, digital technology at that. And as you said right in the beginning in your opening comments, I think data is going to be everything. And surveillance requires a lot of data. And, to know what vaccine is working when, and how often do you have to vaccinate people, and when do you need a booster dose, all this will evolve over the years. But I think digital databases, technology platforms are going to be extremely important. And, when I travel around the world, I feel very proud that India has done a great job of its own technology-led immunization for COVID-19.
No, absolutely with you. And, to be able to have 50,000 immunization points in practically no time across the country, urban, rural, and it's just been a fantastic journey. And, the technology platform that we use is now going to other countries. I'm hearing of Indonesia, Malaysia, we're talking to Nepal. A lot of these countries are actually looking at our technology platform as the way forward for vaccination. But I'm going to, Kiran, I'm going to take you to the demand side of it very quickly. And, there seems to be an emerging issue with vaccine hesitancy. We saw that just before the second wave, but probably the second wave pushed many of us into actually going out and get vaccinated. Any suggestions on what we can do to increase vaccine acceptance, instill confidence, and also fight misinformation campaigns? If you could just shed a little light, because I know, I've been following you for many years now, and the great work that you've done around insulin and all of that. So what do you think from a consumer perspective? What can we do?
So first and foremost, of course, you've seen that with the Omicron virus, the vaccine hesitancy has certainly reduced quite significantly, at least in India. So one is, for people to be more aware of what vaccines do and how they protect you. I would have thought that in any country that was ravaged with any wave, which saw thousands of people dying, and a country like ours where we saw, helpless people without oxygen, people just dying when they contracted the virus. I thought that would have instilled a sense of fear into people to want to be vaccinated. But obviously, there's still a very large percentage of people, especially within rural India, who believe that immunization for some reason makes you infertile. I think that's really the biggest worry of most people in any part of the world. They believe that it affects your health, it affects your ability to, reproduce. And so that's the data we need to really, really sort of share with people to make sure that they realize that that's not the case. As you know, even, children being vaccinated is also not at a very high level. And you know that in this pandemic, in fact, it had another effect. The fallout was that 23 million people in the world have not received their childhood vaccines. That's another worry. But I think in general, most people also don't like to vaccinate their children. And that's also another huge problem with vaccine hesitancy. So I think it is really a matter of science being explained in a simpler way. And I think people have to trust science. Science and society need to be connected. And I know that in my city of Bengaluru, we are trying to basically connect the society with science in a much more transparent and easier to understand way. Because when people understand what science is all about, I think they start trusting science more. Right now, society at large don't trust scientists and science. And they feel that we're experimenting with them. For some reason, there's this huge notion that they are guinea pigs. So I think we need to remove those kind of fears from people. And I think it's really about building trust in science.
Fantastic. And so, when you said Omicron has now got people, again, back to the vaccination drive, I'm kind of thinking, are we over resilient? So, we We only respond when there's a pandemic or when there's a challenge, and maybe that's a challenge by itself, which we need to deal with. I have a lot of questions of my own, but we have only 20 more minutes. So I'm going to go to the audience questions, and because it's important that we also respond to some of those. So Robin, I'm going to come to you. The question from the audience is, how can vaccine partnerships in the Indo-Pacific region be strengthened to curb the threat of infectious disease going forward? Any thoughts on that, Robin?
Yes, and I think I would take the answer a little bit beyond vaccine partnerships. Certainly, it's important that some of the things we've already talked about are put in place, a more diversified manufacturing capacity, and the strengthening of immunization systems so that they are capable of disseminating vaccines more quickly in the future. But there's a whole lot of background work that also needs to be done. And, there's this, famous or perhaps hackneyed phrase in the sort of development community that investment in health security follows a pattern of panic and neglect. And it's absolutely true. I've sort of been around long enough that, I've seen the investments that followed the avian influenza outbreaks in the late 2000s, which led to a stream of funding for certain activities around surveillance and animal health and so forth, up till around 2012, and then you saw that fall away. I hope that this global event has been of such a magnitude that there isn't simply a temporary funding blip, and that institutional change follows, and that not only at the national level, so that countries are individually better able to prevent, detect, and respond to infectious disease outbreaks, including with vaccines, but also at the regional levels, so that there is stronger inter-country cooperation. That might be, for example, among the ASEAN nations, or it might be on a broader geographic basis. But I think it's very important that we find ways of strengthening regional cooperation for pathogen surveillance, for health emergency response, where countries really help each other. And so I don't think it's just about vaccines. You've really got to look at the whole system.
Thanks, Robin. Yeah, so it's going to be all about global health security, and probably vaccines is one of the tools, and we need more partnerships. We need to ensure that the partnerships that have got created continue to remain as we go forward. Mahima, coming back to you, there's a question again from the audience. During the second wave, India faced a lot of supply issues for raw materials. And I know you kind of alluded to that in your opening remarks, but how should we make sure that the supply of vaccines is resilient in the future? How do we deal with that piece is the question.
Sure, thanks. I mean, I just do want to put in context, apart from the fact that many countries became wary, they wanted to secure vaccines for themselves before they were willing to export, so setting that aside, we should keep in context that on average, any vaccine you need, potentially 100 million doses, because it's mostly for kids, it's mostly for children. So if you take the pediatric birth cohort, it's about 27 million times 3, assuming 3 doses on average you give, and 20% wastages. So give or take, for India, you need about 100 million doses on an annual basis among several manufacturers, right? This is normal times. Suddenly COVID comes along, and we're trying to make 2 billion doses of vaccine. This is just our company. I'm not talking about Serum and Bharat and everyone else trying to make vaccines. So it's not just about us having the ability to scale from a process standpoint, but it's also the entire value chain involved. So the raw materials, the consumables like filters, filter assemblies, vials, cold chain infrastructure, everybody needs to scale. So it is not normal times, and these are unprecedented situations. So that's the challenge we're dealing with. Should we always be prepared to scale at that level? Maybe it's not the most efficient investment. So we really need to be creative about, what is the scale at which you have the ability to quickly transform a manufacturing facility or leverage cold chain infrastructure for other programs, so on and so forth. So I think that's this sort of wise way to do it. But to be honest, I think the government has been thinking pretty seriously about how do you ensure you're not dependent on key APIs. So another example is adjuvants. Some of these adjuvants can be made in-house, but some of these adjuvants are proprietary. And the government's been very encouraging, partly through schemes such as the PLI scheme. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a production-linked incentive scheme. So it's basically incentivizing manufacturers to make more product and make it in India. So through schemes such as these, they are incentivizing manufacturers to kind of backward integrate, creating less of a dependence on materials. But bear in mind, this can't be done for all materials. Some of them are so specialized that there's a single source of supply for 20 to 30% of these materials. They're that specialized. And it's important for us to, for instance, look at medical devices, administration, and look at how can we really create the technology platforms and the ecosystem for people to make those sorts of investments. But again, we're competing in India with companies that are supported through basic research, through huge publicly funded programs. For instance, in the United States, a lot of the research that even pharma companies do come out of academia. So we really need to be thinking big about investing in some of these basic things. The API problem, in my view, is a bigger one, right? Because we sort of lost our competitive advantage for several decades. And to regain that overnight, I don't think a couple of schemes will solve it. The pharma industry has also learned, we've made significant investments in sort of technologies that have lesser impact or lesser negative impact on the environment and so on. But I think for India to regain a prominence on the API side is going to take, again, a huge amount of investment and vision from the government for us to be able to become much more self-reliant. But the other way to look at it is there are so many opportunities for entrepreneurs to keep thinking about these things differently. And particularly when you look at how mRNA vaccines are produced, and there's incredible delivery technologies being evaluated, and Path is involved in some of these works in patch microneedles and all of that. So I think that's where the future is headed, and it's a great opportunity for entrepreneurship, but it does require a huge amount of investments. We should stop kidding ourselves that it doesn't, and really commit to this in a much larger way.
Thanks, Mahima. I was recently in Kathmandu in Nepal, and I was talking to the government there, the Ministry of Health, and they were sitting there and saying, okay, what do we do? If you think about equity, I mean, in India, I think we are privileged actually, because we do have manufacturing, we do have support, but when they didn't get their COVAX supplies, their immunization program just fell flat, and they're still struggling to bring it back on track. And of course, we're trying to support, but it's in India, like I said, we are fairly privileged. We will have to think global, regional, as Robin mentioned, maybe more regional coordination mechanisms. And how are things going to move? How are the raw materials going to move between these regions in this and the next pandemic? Fantastic segue talking about government. I'm going to come back to Kiran, and there's a question from the audience. How can we what incentives should the government of India provide for spurring investment in R&D, not just vaccine manufacturing? Because we will have to, like Mahima said, go back a little bit. think about APIs and beyond just vaccine manufacturing. So Kiran, some thoughts on that?
Yeah. So actually, I'd like to share with the audience that the government is already in the process of preparing a note for the cabinet in the form of research-linked incentives. And I know that all of us were involved in providing some inputs to the Niti Aayog for coming up with this kind of an incentive, plan. I think research is going to be extremely important for driving non-linear growth, because I think without innovation, you can't do that. And I think India has the talent base to do that, and we should not lose that opportunity. I think we have, over time, we've kind of neglected research and innovation of a certain, level, both in industry as well as in academia. And as Mahima very rightly said, I think it is academia that needs to really, really rev up its research capabilities, because unless we don't have a virtuous ecosystem of academic thought leadership in new ideas, which then get translated into startups, which in turn then can basically license these programs to larger companies and get it to scale, and get the royalty and sort of financial ecosystem created in that way, we are not going to be successful. So one of the things that we need to do is definitely, I think the research-linked incentive scheme has brought this into focus. The government is very seized about the importance of research in economic growth. And I think it's going to be a very important policy for the government to announce. Secondly, I think it's also very important for us to start creating tech transfer offices within academic research institutions. I think most research institutions totally lose sight of the fact that they have some very proprietary knowledge which can be licensed, which can be translated into innovation, which can actually solve a number of big problems. And I think that is the kind of ethos we need to instill in our research institutions. And I do hope that the government starts creating these tech transfer offices within key research institutions, which actually can have a very strong business development focus, a group that really tracks patents, licenses patents, etc., etc. So I think when that happens, then automatically industry will start reaching out to academia for new, seed innovation. So I think that's the way we have to go about it. But I'm happy to say that research-linked incentives are going to, become a reality. The Niti Aayog has submitted a proposal to the government, and let's hope that it's rolled out soon.
Thanks, Kiran. And yeah, I think already under the Principal Scientific Advisor's Office, they are trying to create some of this ecosystem. And I know that Professor Vijayaraghavan has been sort of instrumental in structuring some of that. But yeah, it's absolutely going to be critical going forward. A final question. We have 7 minutes before the organizers cut us off. So just to quickly run around the table, any of you who would like to respond to this, how soon should India introduce a booster dose? This came from the audience, and I know it's a bit controversial, but it'll be good to hear your thoughts. Any of you who wants to come in? Mahima.
Yeah. At the cost of sounding like I have vested interest, so maybe I should have a disclaimer beforehand. But I think the evidence is out there that different vaccines have waning antibody levels post 4 to 6 months post-vaccination, some much more than others, which is why you suddenly seen, well, not I guess suddenly, but there was a pretty determined need to include boosters, for example, in the United States. What's unclear is, most people don't publish this or talk about it, is how these vaccines are working against the existing variants and the new variants. But one thing that seems to be clear is that if your antibody levels stay high, you seem to be preventing any kind of severe disease, even if there's a variant change. So my personal belief is that we will head in the direction where boosters will get introduced, particularly if you've taken some vaccines. WHO gave guidance 3 days ago that if you've taken an inactivated vaccine, you must take a booster. If you're immunocompromised, you must take a booster. So this was just like 3-4 days ago. So I think we're headed in that direction. A lot will depend on which vaccines you've taken and when the booster should be given. Should it be 4 months, 6 months? Will it be different for healthcare workers? Of course, this discussion is a difficult one to have in the context of majority of kind of the developing world not having full coverage with even the primary series. So it makes one nervous to kind of suggest that everyone should go out there and have a booster, making this inequity even more extreme than it already is. So that's what I'll have to say about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Kiran, I was going to ask you, from a global inequity perspective, booster doses are going to probably widen that gap. So maybe just a couple of minutes on your thoughts.
Well, I think, I personally believe that first and foremost, if there's evidence to show that you get more protection against severe disease with a booster shot, then nobody can argue against that, because you need to do that. But at the same time, I think we also know that there's enough immune escape taking place with the new variants. So would you like to kind of exhaust all your vaccine doses with just randomly immunizing everybody with a booster shot? Or like Mahima said, should you basically target those who are vulnerable, those who are immune compromised, those who are frontline workers with this kind of extra protection? I think we also don't have enough data to tell us whether even a waning antibody, is it not protecting us against severe disease? I think that data also needs to be, shared, because right now it suits everyone to say, let's go for an extra booster. But I'd like to see data that says that if you've had 2 doses, you're fairly well protected against severe disease. And whilst it's nice to boost your antibody levels with a booster dose, can we not make sure that everybody in the world at least has their shot of the vaccine? And we also know that there are attempts to now develop new generation vaccines which actually take care of all these emerging variants. So would you not like to wait for that to get a booster shot? So I just want to know, if you're well protected against severe disease with 2 shots of vaccines, then why are you in a hurry to get that extra protection in a booster shot just yet? I mean, I can share with you that a few weeks ago, I had a mini pandemic in my own household, where although all of us were vaccinated, we had quite a few members of the household testing positive. But the good news was nobody had to be hospitalized. It was very mild and everyone fully recovered within a week or 10 days. Everyone tested negative. So, to me, that was a kind of an indication that, the vaccines do protect.
Absolutely.
And this was the same, and they were all sequenced, by the way, for Delta. And as you know, the Delta variant ravaged India in the months of April and May, when we were very poorly vaccinated.
Sure.
So the fact that, the same Delta variant has caused mild disease, now at least in my little microcosm, I just feel that, we should look at such data before jumping into a booster shot.
Absolutely. Robin, you get the last word. Quick thoughts, and I know, I know you're going to talk about equity. So go ahead.
Yes, and I'm not going to suggest any prescription for India's vaccination policy, but so just say 2 quick things. So, Australia, like many developed countries, does have a policy of progressively providing boosters for its population, and our technical advisory group on immunisation has just decided that the interval should be reduced from 6 months to 5 months in light of what is known, what little is known about Omicron. So, I mean, that is a fairly common situation. But you're right, like we are very conscious of the trade-offs, and when it comes to the distribution of vaccines from our supply to other countries in the region, we are just beginning to experience requests for the supply of vaccines for use as boosters, and we are willing to do that. It would be hypocritical not to, but it is a scarce resource, and we're seeking to be sure that boosters are used for the high priority segments of the population, particularly healthcare workers, and we want to be sure that within our region the primary course vaccination requirements are met ahead of the provision of booster doses.
Thank you.
So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Robin. That's fantastic. And we've just come to time. I would have loved to continue chatting with you. What a fantastic rocking panel. And I'm going to hand over back to the organizers. Thank you so much for being with me, and fantastic panel. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.